Hello, welcome back. It's another installation on the Clausewitz on War series. Um, this time we're going to do. I know I've kind of skipped over a lot of chapters here. My plan was to do more of them, but I kind of just read through it and then pick something that kind of stands out to me, something that I feel like I'm going to be able to have a kind of interesting take on. There's kind of no point in doing every single chapter and just giving some spark notes kind of, summary. So I've chosen this one, The People in Arms, because I thought it was actually quite an interesting chapter when I didn't really expect it so much from Clausewitz. Obviously, this kind of relates more to issues of kind of domestic, like army building. How do you build an army? How do you train an army? Can an army be built, for example, in like an insurgency situation where you have someone who builds an army out of a people against the army of the state, for example, or how does the state employ more people into the army from the general population? It's kind of question of kind of army building, and the non-professional sort of aspect to the military, which I actually think is the most interesting and important aspect of the military. In our time, when the military gets too professionalized, it basically just uses technology. I mean, it's basically what it does. It just goes. I mean, look at like NATO. All these armies in NATO are basically like they're not really armies in the traditional sense. There's no soldiers actually really in these armies in the traditional sense. These are kind of personnel. They're kind of professionalized military personnel. And they sort of like they're kind of like almost like there's a kind of managerial sort of character to them. They sort of oversee a set of kind of technological security systems or something. Like this is kind of what the kind of wealthy, affluent, technologically advanced modern military has kind of become. It's kind of developed after World War II in that way. Now, obviously, there's lots of examples which are very different to this. You can think of like in the Middle East, there's lots of kind of militias or people that get together on the basis of something that's more traditional to you can call it kind of a people's army or something like this. So Clausewitz, I'll just read to introduce the beginning of this chapter. He says, in the civilized parts of Europe, war by means of popular uprisings is a phenomena of the 19th century. It has its advocates and its opponents. The latter object to it either on political grounds, considering it to be a means of revolution, a state of legalized anarchy that is as much a threat to the social order at home as it is to the enemy, or on military grounds because they feel that the results are not commensurate with the energies they have expended. So basically, the objections are either that it could be effective militarily, but it's going to destabilize your domestic situation, and it could be effective, and it could be ineffective in the practical military sense of beating an enemy because, I suppose, because they're not like professional enough, they're not trained enough, whatever. So just to kind of give this a bit of historical context, I think this is interesting coming from a Prussian because Prussia was undergoing at this time a lot of reform and change within their own military because their own military was a bit more. It wasn't like professionalized in the contemporary sense of professional, but it was quite elite. You know, it was something that was overseen by more of a nobility, and Prussia was always a kind of very kind of proud militaristic kingdom, and um, it the sort of need to incorporate like people from the middle classes or the peasantry into the military and the kind of political questions around that were a kind of big kind of deal for Prussia at the time. There's a very good book I bought a while back and I don't have it with me so I can't check the title, but it's basically like one of these like classically scholarly historian books with these boring titles and they're very big and thick books, and it was like it's the history of the Prussian military from, I think it was like 1750 until basically Prussia stopped being a state. And I didn't read all of it because it was like fucking 400 pages, but the chapters I read were quite interesting because it was going over some of the political contentions over drawing in people from the middle classes into the military. For example, like the middle classes could be in the military, but they were sort of set at a certain rank, like they couldn't get above a certain rank, and they gradually sort of had to debate within the military about whether they should get rid of this rule in order to encourage more participation within the military, and so on and so forth. And this was also a crisis that was sparked basically by Napoleon. I mean, this whole book is basically something which is like Napoleon is the kind of shadow which overlooks this whole book. This book was written kind of over a long time. Google it, you're gonna get something like between 1816 and 1830 in or around. So this book was like written in the aftermath of the downfall of Napoleon, but also obviously with the success of Napoleon. We always like to think of the downfall of Napoleon, but like what really changed the world was Napoleon's success. It wasn't his failure. I mean, obviously, I think geopolitically things turned out quite different because of his failure, but even with that geopolitical failure, you know, France didn't become like the kind of unifying center of a kind of new European kind of empire or something like that. But Napoleon himself and his military success has completely changed everything. And this book can be seen very much as a kind of need to think through that new historical reality. And one of the big topics, of course, which is probably why Clausewitz is not starting his book and saying people in arms, idiots, don't know what they're doing, leave everything to the nobility, is because clearly the French Revolution, with the help of Napoleon and the Napoleonic legions, proved actually that breaking open the army to a kind of more of a national service system, which incorporated like merit, which did dissolve, which like the kind of dissolution of these feudal hierarchical structures was very effective. It was very effective on the level of moral energy, fighting for this nation with this kind of national destiny. It was an extremely powerful force, which was very much a kind of moral force within the French, within the Napoleonic army, and also on the pure system of merit. I mean, like, it does make sense. You kind of break open the feudal hierarchy a little bit, and you kind of let people in from the middle classes or the peasantry or whatever, give them roles that maybe they could not previously aspire to based on their merit. You know, it's a motivating force, and it worked. I think you could even talk of the American War of Independence in the same regard. I mean, if you look at the history of and I'm not very well read on this, but you know the basic stuff. If you look at the history of the American War of Independence, like the Redcoats were these professional, very well trained military who were very hard to beat in like linear line combat at the time. You know, this kind of typical combat you see at that time where people stand in their formation and shoot these muskets, very slow to load, kind of close range firing muskets at each other. The Redcoats, you know, were impossible to beat, but the kind of people's militia, this kind of idea of breaking away from the British Empire and having your own country, and the kind of ideals which were manifesting around that, they sort of intertwined with a kind of people's army or a kind of militia idea, which did eventually win. Right, which eventually, with enough time, won out. So you have a crisis going on. This is like, let's say this is 1830, 1820, 1815, whatever. Right, you have this crisis going on within the past 50 years, 50, 60 years of Western history, where basically like ideals and kind of people's armies and kind of fighting for like liberation and let's say more sort of let's say military action, which is more intertwined with ideals, particularly enlightened ideals, um, which is which is wielded by institutions which aren't subject to the same stringent social hierarchy that you get in the pre-national, we could say, um, social structure. It's basically like a contest between the old social structure and this new one. And the new one is on the pure basis of kind of military competence and prowess, is winning again and again and again. So you have to kind of contend with that as anyone who's thinking about army building and military virtue and anything that's related to that. So Clausewitz says, he's contemplating the new military models, which kind of break that, which surpass the old social hierarchies and social structures. And he says, the innovations first mentioned were the natural, inevitable consequences of the breaking down of barriers. They added so immensely to the strength of the side that first employed them that the opponent was carried along and had to follow suit. That will also hold true of the People's War. So here I think he's talking about like whether or not that will hold true to creating an army that will fight kind of internally within a society. Any nation that uses it intelligently will, as a rule, gain some superiority over those who disdain its use. If this is so, the question only remains whether mankind at large will gain by this further expansion of the element of war, a question to which the answer should be the same as to the question of war itself. And he says we shall leave both to the philosophers. So here we are being philosophical all this time later, thinking about it. So he was right. He'll leave it to us. Okay, but yeah. So basically, he's saying it's inevitable that the old systems would break down and a new system would come about, because it's going to be basically more effective than anyone who disdains its use. But the question of whether this will be good for mankind or not is another question. That's kind of basically what he's saying. I think you could also basically contextualize Napoleon's relationship to the aristocrats of Europe at the time in that exact way. And like on one level, they were like, we don't know if this is going to be good for society in the long run. But I mean, obviously, they're not thinking it's going to be good for them in the long run, obviously. But let's give them some benefit of the doubt. And there's a kind of nagging philosophical question was there, and it's kind of wondering like whether or not this breakdown of the old social structures in regards to the military would be good. I mean, like one could look at World War One and World War Two and say, well, particularly World War One, I think, because World War One basically kind of created the condition of World War Two. So you could look at World War One and say, oh, look, it wasn't good. These breaking down the social structure into these new models of military service and universal conscription and kind of national idealisms and so forth. Though, you could say it wasn't good. So I mean, like there probably is room to give at least some credence to the suspicions and concerns of the late 19th century, or sorry, the late 18th, early 19th century. But you could contextualize, I think, Napoleon's contention with the rest of Europe at the time in that way, like he is breaking down. He is kind of a force which is so basically you have a superior military model based on new ideals and based on the breaking down of previous social structures. And the other people in Europe, I mean, all these kind of aristocracies that were built off of being back in the day. I mean, at this point they're often not very warlike anymore, but they were at least at the beginning of their sort of legacy, their kind of their sort of bloodline. We could say there's a lot of military virtue which the old aristocracies are built on, and you can kind of say, well, they admire Napoleon and the French on the level of being militarily superior, but on the level of them doing it within a new sort of social structure, which is breaking down the old one. Obviously, they don't like that part, so they have a very convoluted relationship to this, which is what makes it interesting. And for this reason, because of these complications, we then have to look at insurrection differently. Because if we're looking at the French and we're saying they had basically a kind of insurrection and a kind of civil war and a kind of uprising that went on just before their army it became so dominant, we sort of have to then sort of wonder, well, then suddenly we're forced to look at insurrection as something which is, let's say, internally painful, but externally quite beneficial, if that makes sense. Like there's a breakdown of the old social structures. There's a conflict and insurrection which happens internally within, like let's say France. But the sort of strange consequences of that was that they became so dominant in beating their enemies externally. So the internal kind of suffering led to a kind of external triumph. I think you could actually look at the United States the exact other way around today. And like since World War II to today, you could say a complete world dominance like never seen before, geopolitically and militarily, which emerged out of the aftermath of first the downfall of Germany, and then the handing over of the kind of Anglospheric imperial crown from the English to the Americans, and then the eventual downfall of the Soviets and Russia. You have these people that are really, really externally successful, but then you see nowadays it's like massive internal suffering. So these sort of ambiguities and tensions between inside and outside start to foment, and the situation gets much more complicated. And I think since the French Revolution that's basically a complication that we've lived with. So therefore, we have to actually think about insurrection maybe a little bit less moralistically. I think that's kind of what Klaus was saying. We have to sort of take it as an actual sort of like legitimate military situation, and not as a complete like moral sin or something, or just pure treason or something. We have to sort of have a more nuanced view of it. So in order for an insurrection to be effective, basically, now that's what we're talking about, he's got a few conditions, and I'm going to read them. The war must be fought in the interior of the country. It must not be decided by a single stroke. The theater of operations must be fairly large. The national character must be suited to that type of war. The country must be rough and inaccessible because of mountains or forests, marshes, or the local methods of cultivation. Okay, so let's talk about all of that in a bit more detail. He says the relative density of the population does not play a decisive part. Rarely are there not enough people for the purpose, nor does it make much difference whether the population is rich or poor. At least it should not be a major consideration, although one must remember that poor men used to hard, strenuous work and privation are generally more vigorous and more warlike. So poor countries could have a huge advantage here. Wealth does not actually always play a significant, kind of beneficial role. A country with a lot of poorer people, they're used to more strenuous work. Maybe they work outside more. They're more warlike in that regard. You do have a problem of education though here too. Like, organization and idealism and all these kind of things that maybe go into forming a people's army. Obviously you kind of need that element too. But nonetheless, the poverty is not exactly a negative thing. He also says one peculiarity of the countryside that greatly enhances the effectiveness of an insurrection is the scattered distribution of houses and farms, which, for instance, can be found in many parts of Germany. Under such conditions, the country will be more cut up and thickly wooded, the roads poorer if more numerous, the billeting of troops will prove infinitely more difficult, and above all, the most characteristic feature of insurgency in general will be constantly repeated in miniature. The element of resistance will exist everywhere and nowhere. Right. So basically, like the uncontrollable terrain. I mean, a kind of dispersed population, cut up between, let's say, a lot of rivers or a lot of forests or mountains, or islands, maybe, serves a resistance better. There's lots of examples you can think of here. You could think of the ancient Greeks and their seafaring, resisting the Persians, using their seafaring, using their islands. Like they know the terrain, they know the islands. The 300 got the Persian army to kind of come through this tiny narrow pass within this cliff, within this cliff face, kind of mountainous cliff face, and they could use it to their advantage. They couldn't have done that on like flat, open ground. Ireland, maybe a good example here too. A lot of countryside, a lot of bad roads. Not really so forested anymore, but you do have a lot of things like bogs, and you have rivers and bogs, and you have a kind of a slightly chaotic landscape, particularly in the west of the country, and to what extent was that used in the Irish War of Independence is a good question. I know, for example, the resistance were able to hide weapons very easily because, like, the countryside in Ireland, I mean, it's not a hugely densely populated country, particularly, well, the east is more densely, but particularly in the west and the Midlands and the north. And if you know the place, you can hide weapons so easily. I mean, there's still stories of people that randomly come into a cache of old of old weapons somewhere, in a bog or something, and that's still kind of I would say there's still loads of weapons out there that haven't been found from the old War of Independence times. The U.S. War of Independence is another good example here. So obviously, like, the settled Americans knew the interior of the country better. They had sort of pushed further inland. At the point, I don't think they'd even pushed that far. I mean, like, for example, I don't think like California was a thing during the War of Independence. I think that came much late after. I don't think like Seattle was a thing. I think I'd like, correct me if anyone is listening to this and they know more about American history than I do, but I'm pretty sure at the time of the War of Independence, I think like the Appalachian Mountains were like the furthest they'd gone, and if you go past that, you're basically in the wilderness with a bunch of natives. So you had this sort of peculiar system, kind of layering during the American War of Independence, where you had like the furthest people inland to the west, where there's a wilderness and natives. I mean, you probably go in there, you probably get killed. You don't want to go in there. Then you have the settled Europeans, but who are now the Americans, and they're sort of occupying the east coast, but they're more familiar with the inland. And then you only have the British, who basically just know the ports. I mean, that's all they know really at that point, is kind of the ports. And I'm pretty sure that the further you go inland, the more the advantage the Americans have, and the further you are to like the coastal area, the kind of external coastal portal areas, probably the better the British have, the more advantage British have. So you have this kind of geographic game which goes on, trying to get people into your own area, And one last thought on geography there is Ukraine and Russia. I kind of think one of the reasons the war has gone on for so long, and it's been such a kind of costly war in terms of, well, human lives, apparently. We're not going to know the numbers for years, but apparently on the Ukrainian side, it's quite costly of human lives. And also weapons, just like, just industrial bases, just having to pump out so much shells and weapons and drones and all this stuff. It's because the whole country's flat. Like, you can't do anything. You can't like tactically use most of the country to your advantage. The whole country's flat. It's just a giant battlefield. Like there isn't really a lot going on there which you can use as like a natural barrier or a natural hiding place. And I think that's one of the reasons why drones have been deployed so much. Like, imagine there was a war in Switzerland, or a war in Greece, or a war in Ireland, or a war in Scotland, or a war in whatever, like a country where there's lots of there's kind of more breakup of the landscape through the ocean and islands, or through I guess the ocean islands don't really help you against drones very much, do they? They do help you against tanks and cavalry, but not really drones. Like, if you're on an island, it's pretty good. So maybe islands aren't good there, but like, think of like Switzerland, for example. If you're fighting a war in Switzerland, how effective are drones going to be when like you have so much woods and so much mountains that you can sort of use as hiding places? Like, what are the drones going to do? They're going to be kind of ineffective. Um, Potentially, I'm not really sure. But the point is, Ukraine doesn't really have a whole lot going on, which could be seen as very useful for like for defense, like natural defense. So perhaps that's one of the reasons why like so much money needs to be pumped into the war. Like you got so much shells and so much artillery and drones constantly, because it's basically just a war of attrition between two sides who has the most firing power basically wins at any given time. Um, so you have this massive drain on the economy, and which goes on there, which could be explained somewhat by the geography. Okay, so enough on geography. He says militia and bands of armed civilians cannot and should not be employed against the main enemy force, or indeed against a sizable enemy force. They are not supposed to pulverize the core, but to nibble at the shell and around the edges. They are meant to operate in areas just outside the theater of war, where the invader will not appear in strength, in order to deny him these areas altogether. And again, like the Irish War of Independence against the British is very similar to that. I mean, they wouldn't have ever won in like a complete all-out kind of open engagement. They won by sort of ambush and using the terrain to their advantage, knowing the terrain better and using the kind of landscape and the hills and the rivers and so on too, for ambush purposes and so on and so forth. And I would probably take a wild guess that that's something that was similar in the American War of Independence, in maybe the Russian Civil War and the Russian Revolution. I would imagine that there was these sorts of tactics were being used. So just in terms of pure tactics of engagement, it's quite interesting what he says here. He says, a general uprising, as we see it, should be nebulous and elusive. Its resistance should never materialize as a concrete body. Otherwise, the enemy can direct sufficient force at its core, crush it, and take many prisoners. When that happens, the people will lose heart, and believing that the issue has been decided and further efforts would be useless, drop their weapons. On the other hand, there must be some concentration at certain points. The fog must thicken and form a dark and menacing cloud of which a bolt of lightning may strike at any time. These points of concentration will, as we have said, lie mainly on the flanks and the enemy's theater of operations. That is where insurgents should build up larger units, better organized, with parties of regulars that will make them look like a proper army and enable them to tackle larger operations. Okay, so basically, I suppose you could say, not like a full-on engagement with the main body of the army, like like two armies meeting each other in the field and all this settled, but but at the same time enough engagement aimed at the mainly at the flanks, which, as he said, puts a menacing cloud over the army from which a bolt of lightning may strike any time. So there's a kind of element of psychological warfare going on here too. If the insurgency does nothing but run away and avoid battle with the main army, even though that's tactically appropriate, it will, the main army will just think it's stronger than it, and you can chase somebody who runs away from you all day. It doesn't really make a difference. So it has to avoid that sort of engagement, but it also has to constantly engage to some extent, favorably with the flanks and so on, in order to basically kind of demoralize, we could also say, the main army, to kind of attack it enough so that it's doing something, but not attack it in a way which allows for the kind of engagement which would be beneficial to the main army. So there's a kind of, it's just basically kind of guerrilla warfare. That's kind of what he's saying. And I suppose in very simple terms, it's quite easy to say, right? It's basically just to do guerrilla warfare. You don't have the numbers or the firepower, don't engage, or the professional competence or whatever. You don't engage head on, but still sort of attack at the flanks, and then, without full engagement and so on. It's kind of easier said than done. The reason is that basically the commander has to command a certain sensibility or within the people's army. He has to like he has to make them courageous enough that they're willing to resist and willing to fight. Because you have to be courageous because you could lose, you could be captured and taken prisoner. You're taking a huge risk. But at the same time, he has to kind of make sure they're courageous enough and they're fighting, but at the same time, like, not so courageous that they're just like recklessly going, everyone's just going in on one last stand sort of battle. Like, let's just have one like big blowout and give it our all, and we'll all die, and like that won't work in the long run, because you're just going to lose and it'll be over, right? So the kind of commanders have to sort of keep this balance going, which is quite difficult, actually. It's probably a lot more difficult to keep that balance going than it is. Well, people just running away in general doesn't need to be commanded. People will just do that, and going in for one big, full on battle against the enemy, I suppose that takes a lot of commanding too. But keeping this balance is probably quite difficult. And you do have to wonder to what extent the craft of this balance has been effective. Like, people that learn this craft, to what extent is that effective? Is that productive and effective for the general mastery of military tactics? Like, because it is quite difficult, and you can kind of say it was cowardly because they're not just having a full fight. They're sort of attacking when it suits them, and that is there is an element of that is true, of course. Like, although it's kind of like, imagine you're a group of 100 men and your enemy is 1,000. It kind of makes sense just logically. It's kind of suicidal just to go, let's just have a full fight, unless you're backed into a corner and you have to, I suppose. But like, to choose that is kind of stupid. So you get into this old conversation, and this goes back to Plato and Laches, of what is courage? Like, is it being so courageous that you're just reckless and stupid? Or, well, no, but is it being so calculated that you're just, averse to any conflict? Well, no. There's something of a balancing act there, which commanders in these situations have to try master. It's really difficult. And it actually reminds me, because there's this question over, again, to use Napoleon as an example, there's a question over why. Well, there's a question of like why the French kind of revolutionary army was able to beat the main army, first of all. But there's also a question of when Napoleon's troops were going through Europe, why didn't the other European militaries try separate the different sections, the different legions, from each other? So let's say Napoleon's army is going from Paris to northern Italy, right, or to Austria, to Vienna, right? Let's just say, why didn't they kind of try separate? Let's say there's 5 different main parts of the Napoleonic body, and they were known to be quite separate from each other at times. They would sort of dislocate, and they would come back together, and they would dislocate and come back together. They weren't all marching in unity the whole time. They had a certain amount of independence. Let's say you had 3 or 4 main parts of the army. They would sort of act quite independently of each other. Like, why didn't the other armies maneuver, let's say, the first section onto its own, and then to beat that one on its own, and then retreat, and then try and maneuver another? Like, why didn't they use that? Well, it's probably because they were just these sort of old school kind of professional European military armies. They couldn't think like that. They couldn't think in this kind of guerrilla style. They can only think of, you have your army and I have my army, and we get together, and whoever's the most courageous and whoever is the smartest on the day wins. But there's often a lot of elements where, like, you're just not going to win. Like, there's numbers, there's just firepower, there's lots of different aspects of which make that a bit futile. And sometimes you see it in history. When you look at history, you see like, well, why didn't they make the intelligent decision, which we would make now as modern people, as where we are today, where we have lots of guerrilla warfare to look at. Like we have so many different examples of basically guerrilla tactics, and we're so informed by that today that we're sort of looking at maybe like how a military would have behaved in 1798 or 1803 or something, and then going like that was stupid. It's because they don't think the same way. It really is a matter of thinking. Okay, so this sort of leads into the last piece of Clausewitz's kind of necessary conditions, which is kind of related to what we were saying earlier with the balancing act between kind of avoiding full engagement, but also engaging enough to deteriorate the army at the same deteriorate the enemy army at the same time. And this is basically the rule of don't um, don't don't put all hopes of victory into one big battle. Now, obviously, this is from the perspective of the People's Army, not from the perspective of the standard military. It says a government must never assume that its country's fate, its whole existence, hangs on the outcome of a single battle, no matter how decisive. Even after a defeat, there's always the possibility that a turn of fortune can be brought about by developing new sources of internal strength or through the natural decimation. Through the natural decimation, all offensive suffer in the long run or by means of help from abroad. There will always be there will always be time enough to die, like a drowning man who will clutch instinctively at a straw. It is the natural law of the moral world that a nation that finds itself on the brink of an abyss will try to save itself by any means. No matter how small and weak a state may be in comparison with its enemy, it must not forego these last efforts, or one would conclude that its soul is dead. The possibility of avoiding total ruin by paying a high price for peace should not be ruled out, but even this intention will not in turn eliminate the usefulness of new measures of defense. They will not make the peace more difficult or onerous, but easier and better. They are even more desirable where help can be expected from other states that have an interest in our survival. A government that, after having lost a major battle, is only interested in letting its people go back to sleep in peace as soon as possible, and overwhelmed by feelings of failure and disappointment, lacks the courage and desire to put forth a final effort, is, because of its weakness, involved in a major inconsistency in any case. It shows that it did not deserve to win, and possibly for that very reason it was unable to. So it's not actually not just insurgency armies here. You could also just say like a weaker state, like one state fighting another state, or one kingdom fighting another kingdom that's smaller and weaker. Okay. So again, not putting all your eggs in one basket, so to speak. But also there's a kind of governing ethos which he's trying to bring out here. It's never just tactical. With Clausewitz, there's always something larger, political or even philosophical, which you can sort of segue into after you go through the kind of slightly tedious, sometimes kind of tactical advice he'll give you. Which is why this is interesting and why I do this, because if it was just pure tactical advice, I wouldn't be making these videos. There's the question of dealing with demoralization after defeat. How does one perpetuate the hope, perpetuate the will to go on, will to fight, will to sort of recuperate and try again? How does a leader deal with this kind of moral exhaustion? And I suppose on a practical level, I don't know, just kind of propaganda, and then try again and hope things turn out better. I mean, I suppose that's kind of the obvious practical thing to do there. But on the level of like being prepared for a long drawn out conflict, one has to assume that there will be failures and setbacks, and you're going to be have to like you're going to have to be able to as like a leader, you're going to have to be able to you're going to have to be willing, excuse me, to like look at a bunch of disappointed people who are demoralized and sort of say, okay, let's keep going, because that's kind of inevitable, especially if you can't win a conflict with one big battle. And I mean, okay, looking at the Ukraine Russia thing here, I think this is kind of applicable to that, because NATO or Russia can't win by one massive big kind of burst of a battle, because that would be too much of a commitment of resources, which neither side is willing to commit, because it's so risky, because we live in a nuclear era, for example. And there also will be future conflicts that they're probably going to be involved with. So they're sort of like unwilling to commit all of their capacity into one big battle. Like, you're not going to have like the Ukraine war, for example, ending because the battle of NATO versus the battle of Russia, like Waterloo or something. It's not really going to work that way, because there's just like both sides just have, there's too much to lose by committing that much manpower, that much resources to one big deciding. This doesn't mean that there won't be like a battle of sorts, I'm sure in which, for example, the Ukrainian regime finally crumbles or gives up or something. It's possible that, like, I don't know, it's possible that could happen, but it won't be necessarily decided by that. It will be decided by all these other factors which were going on for years before that, and that's just the sort of moment that we recognize as being the moment that ends. These sort of deciding battles, these decisive battles, it don't seem to be as common anymore. I think that's just because the level of risk with nuclear weapons involved is so high that committing so much to it increases the risk of nuclear conflict. And there's also the fact that these states are going to be thinking about a multitude of different potential conflicts they're going to be involved with in the next. Like, the only time you're going to see that is if a country is like defending itself, like it's defending its existence. I suppose that's the situation where that could happen. Like, like there's like it either wins a battle or it sort of like loses its sovereignty completely, or it's sort of disintegrated as a state. There's a complete inexistence or something which is going to be lost. It's the only time you're going to see this absolute commitment to, all arms on deck, decisive battle mentality. But even in such an instance, it's not necessarily always totally advisable. Like, I suppose there's always like somewhere you can step back into and kind of recuperate and rethink. Like, there probably is a threshold that once it goes past is inevitable, but it's difficult to tell where that is. It's difficult as if you're leading a resistance, or if you're fighting another state much more powerful than you, it's sort of difficult to exactly pinpoint when a defeat is like the defeat, or a defeat is just another defeat. Like, as they say, you've won the battle, but you haven't won the war. At what point is it just another battle, or at what point is this last battle like the war? There's a kind of philosophy of defeat here, which kind of asks the sort of ontological question almost of like, where does losing a battle turn into losing the war? Like, at what point? And sometimes in history that's really obvious. I mean, like Waterloo is a good example. It's really obvious. I mean, I think if there's a lot of like, I think in antiquity or the Middle Ages, this was a little bit. Sometimes this was more obvious, and it wasn't always obvious. You've got lots of examples of like, the Vikings winning a battle against the Anglo kings in England, and then the Anglo king goes into kind of exile in France or something for 2 years, and then comes back and himself wins a battle. There's lots of these historical examples in history, but I do think like the earlier you go, you sort of have a kind of more clear-cut set of like battles which were kind of observably decisive. And I think the reason is that like, in order to get there, both sides need to commit enough resources in which in which like the loser just won't have anything left to give, so to speak. Right, it's kind of, and then it will end, or there could be a peace agreement, and there's a political negotiation that could be that could be done. But the problem with that is like the worse the two sides, like the more the two sides hate each other, the more hatred that's built up over time, the harder and harder it is to actually get that peace agreement. So basically, you're in a situation where it's like you don't want both sides to like to be like we'll die on our feet rather than like so you said we'll die on our feet rather than live on our knees. If we want like we're absolutely not going to give up until we're dead. Like if one side has that attitude, but is willing, but can be defeated at the same time, well then it will end. The other opportunity is some sort of diplomatic or some sort of political agreement. But the more hatred there is, the less likely that is. So again, look at Russia and Ukraine. It's kind of like there was the possibilities for kind of a political agreement at first, within like the first year of the war, because less hatred is there. But then like 4 or 5 years later, there's more hatred than at first, but at the same, was making a peace agreement less likely. But at the same time, you don't really have both sides like just like willing to like commit all of its resources in one go and sort of have that big decisive battle. That doesn't really seem to be like a possibility either. So therefore you get this kind of like chronic state of conflict in which no one really knows. Like it's like, oh, like you hear it on the news. It's like don't even call it the battle, but they'll say like, oh, like Russia took this town or Ukraine took back this town, and it's kind of completely meaningless. It's like, what does it mean in the greater scheme of things, right? Well, that's the difference between winning the battle and winning the war. It's just another battle that's won, and it's not the war. And there's a kind of separation of those two things from each other, in which you get into a state of kind of like fatigued meaninglessness, which is where the conflict there is now. It's at this stage of we're kind of post political agreement. There's too much resentment built up. No one's willing to kind of go all in, and you just have these sort of like chronic state of continuous conflict, which never results in a sort of decisive outcome for the larger strategic situation. It's basically where that situation is. So a kind of clever question, if you were studying like war studies or something in university, and if you were like going to do a PhD, I mean, this would be like the perfect topic to do it on. Like it's like the history of like decisive conflict versus like the history of like indecisive conflict. Like, is there a historical element to it? Like, was there a time in history where battles were just like 70-80% of the time decisive and like 20-30% of the time like indecisive for the larger strategic situation? And then is it something about technology? Is it something about the functioning of modern states? Is it something about modern economies? What is it that makes this situation of indecisive conflict, like chronic indecisive conflict, like what is that? What is the thing which causes that? It's a good question. But anyway, it's the kind of things you think about when you read Clausewitz very closely. Anyway, that's this installment. So thank you for listening.